Welcome to the London Business School webinar series, Leading Through a Pandemic. I'm Julian Birkinshaw, a professor here at London Business School, and I'll be your host for the entire series. We thought we would start with a very practical topic, one which everybody, I mean literally everybody, is now wholly engaged with, which is the challenge of working virtually. And who better to lead this session than Professor Lynda Gratton, a leading authority on many aspects of managing people, careers, the future of work more generally. Lynda's been at LBS for more than 20 years, longer in fact than I have, as a permanent fixture on the Thinkers 50 list of the top management thinkers in the world. I believe she is ranked number 13 at the moment. Lynda has also, fortunately, done some work specifically on this topic of virtual working, and she's done that over a number of years. So she really is perfectly placed to help us with this topic. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Lynda. Lynda, welcome again.
Thank you,
and
Julian.
We're going to let you steer us through this topic. Give us a bit of context, a bit of history, and a little bit of practical advice, and then we're going to get a bit of a discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julian, and welcome everybody, thousands I can see online right now, to this webinar on virtual working. I've been studying it actually since the 1980s, and that was, remember, for those of you around in the 1980s, and as Julian has suggested, I certainly was. That was when you first brought your personal computer home. I don't know if you remember those days. And we've been looking at it ever since. And what I'd like to do in this webinar is to say something about what we've learnt, but then also to say, what does that mean for us? I'm going to come up with 6 actions I think you should be taking right now to ensure that you can, and your colleagues, the people that you lead, can really make the most of the time that we have ahead of us in terms of home working. Now, when I said it started in the 1980s, of course, most of us didn't work from home. In fact, even now, most of us don't work from home. Well, we didn't until a few days ago. So let me ask the first poll. So may we have the first poll, please? And the first poll is simply to find out just where you are right now. So first poll is coming up now. Now, which of you?
Poll number 2.
That's poll number 2. Let's get poll number 1 up. Can we get poll number 1 up, please? Okay, poll number 1. Where are you now? Are you in your work office, like we are? Are you at home? Are you in a working hub? You know, those places that you can go to nearby, maybe even, or are you somewhere else? The Isle of Skye, coffee house, sitting in your beach hut. Most of us are working at home. Isn't that extraordinary? And actually, one thing I'm going to say during my conversation today is this is an enormous opportunity for us to experiment with something that many of us have always wanted to do, which is to spend more time working from home. 88% of the thousands of people who have come in right now are working from home. Now, how are you finding it? Well, let's move on and say a little bit more about what we know around virtual working. So let's move on to the second slide. Thank you. Okay. So really, when you think about virtual working, working from home, I'd like you to think about it really as a story of social and technological ingenuity. And it has, in my view, 3 elements. And those are elements that I'm going to return to as we talk about what it is to work virtually. The first, of course, is technological. You know, you started working at home in the 1980s because you had a personal computer that you could bring home and start using at home. And that's why the social pioneers of home working were freelancers who brought their laptops home, their big personal computers, you might remember them, to actually, Julian's nodding here, that actually work from home. So, and of course that technology has evolved, and the very fact that we can now have thousands of people connected shows that technology is moving very fast. And that, by the way, is going to be a very important part of the story I want to tell today. But it isn't just about technology, because what those early pioneers found is although working from home had lots of advantages, the disadvantage was that they were lonely, some of them, isolated, and also companies fretted that maybe they weren't as innovative as they might have been because they weren't collaborating, it wasn't face-to-face. So the second element I want to talk about today is social. You're probably not thinking about this yet because you're all scrambling to get your technology right and find a chair that you can sit in and a desk and so on and try and help your employees to do that. But my prediction is very quickly we're going to think about the social aspects of it because humans are very, very social animals. And when we are put in our home like this, as many of us are isolated, then that's going to have implications on our relationships with ourselves in terms of our own mental health, but also our relationships with others. So the second element is social. The third is work itself, because the sort of work that you do in an office when you've got lots of people around you and the tasks that you perform are not going to be the same as the ones that you do at home. So when we think about virtual working, we need to think about those three elements. We need to think about the technological aspects of it, the social aspects, and also the design of work aspects. But and that, by the way, then becomes virtual working. So let me tell you a little bit about the story of virtual working, which, by the way, in the past has also been influenced by external events. This isn't the first time it has been. So let's just also think a bit about how that's done and what we can learn from what I would call the waves of virtual working that started, by the way, in the 1980s. And it started with those virtual freelancers, the people who were working from home, often using their own personal home computers. Here's one. If you don't remember what it looked like, it took up a lot of space. And by 1990, Elance, the platform company, had launched, which allowed people to share work between each other. And remember, by 1995, eBay was on the platform, and that meant that people could also sell goods. So the 1980s was really a time when we were experimenting with moving out of an office because we were selling stuff or working on stuff, and we were using the computers that had just emerged. Now, what did those social pioneers find? Because we were researching them at that time. Well, we found that some of them were independent consultants, some of them were freelancers, and what they loved was autonomy and flexibility. And maybe you're feeling that right now, even though you're probably worried about the technology, there's a little bit of you that's perhaps thinking, and your employees are thinking, I now have more autonomy and I have more flexibility. But what we also found during that period when we were researching these at-home freelancers is that they worried about being part of a community. And they also worried about what I as a psychologist would call tacit knowledge. The sort of knowledge that isn't easily shared by reading something, the sort of knowledge you get when you're hanging around watching somebody. Both of us have children who are doctors. Exactly. And we were just speaking a moment ago that means that, they learned a lot through watching other doctors. Okay, so that was what I would call wave one. Now, wave two, which really started in the early 2000s, was when it moved from social pioneers who were freelancers at home into the corporation. And you, in corporations, in large corporations, suddenly had virtual corporate colleagues. By the way, and we wrote this in a Harvard Business Review in 2013, myself and Tammy Jones. 1911 made a big difference, and so did the SARS epidemic in 2002. So this isn't the first time that actually a pandemic has made an impact on the way that we work. One of the things that we thought actually after the SARS pandemic was that we never went back exactly to how we were before. And that's one of the things I want us to think about today, is will we ever return to how we worked before? I don't think we will. And I just want us to think that what we're experiencing now isn't isn't just a blip. It will fundamentally change the way that we work. So where were we in the 2000s? Well, I'd say work anywhere, anytime. Do you remember those? Some of you might have been working in companies that said to you, work anytime, anywhere. And that's because we now had the collaborative communications and the collaborative tools to allow people to work from home. So your employees were now working from home, and you were often okay about that. But from a social perspective, you did begin to wonder whether they were less engaged. There wasn't any data to show that, by the way. And also you fretted a bit about productivity as managers. You know, if people were out of sight, well, they might have been anywhere, anytime, but they were also out of sight. And companies began to sort of worry about that. And in terms of work, they began to struggle with how do you manage people working from home and how do you measure their performance. And a very interesting research project, which I actually wrote up in one of my books called The Shift some years back, was the experiment that British Telecom did, where they sent half of their group to work from home and then half of them to stay in the office. And they measured, it was a proper experiment, so they had baseline measures and then they measured a whole series of measures across a time period. So they measured engagement, retention, productivity. They had good measures of those three things. What they found was this, that if from the start, if you use the baseline measures of the at-home workers and the employment workers, the people working from the office workers, what you found is very quickly the productivity of the at-home workers deteriorated. And the reason it deteriorated, and we looked at this very closely, was because they didn't know how to use the technology and they didn't know how to work together. Over time, as they learned how to use that technology and as they learned how to work together collaboratively, their productivity, engagement, and performance increased. So it was the same level as the office workers. And for some teams, it actually was higher. So there is a possibility that working from home might not be a stall to productivity and might be an actual bonus to productivity. But as I'm going to show later, to get that right, you have to be, like BT, learn very quickly how to actually work from home. And that then led to what I would call the third wave. And this is when we wrote the Harvard Business Review about this in 2013, which we called virtual co-workers, because what was beginning to happen is that we now had low-cost collaborative tools. You know, companies were beginning now to join up all their employees and video costs were falling. You remember, even a decade ago, this would not have been possible. This would have been a very expensive piece of kit and it would have been breaking all the time. It looks as if this is going to work perfectly. Fingers crossed. But what happened is that people who were now working from home began to feel lonely and isolated. And so there was then co-working hubs, often based in smaller towns or areas where employees could congregate, not in their office, their main office, but actually in hubs where they could work together. And by the way, freelancers did the same. And this is why you're seeing the huge growth of these co-working spaces, because actually all of the people who work in WeWork now could work at home, but they choose not to because humans like being near other people. And this is, I think, something we've really got to take into consideration as we think about this new phase that we're entering. People work also realized how to divide and distribute tasks, but also worried about natural communication. Where are we now? I'm going to call it the mass experiment. So when I go back and write about this, as I'm sure we will, in fact, I've already written something which you'll see in a few days' time. When we talk about the mass experiment, this has never happened before. We've had asynchronous home working where some of us work from home some of the time. Maybe because you are a parent of young kids, or because you were caring for somebody, or because you wanted to choose to work from home that day. But remember, this is these were just few, some people some of the time. So that was asynchronous. The reason it's so sort of fascinating now is it's everybody or many people all of the time. That means it's synchronous. And that actually is going to really change the way that we think about this. Now, we have got extraordinary corporate platforms and also the capacity to have many conversations. In my own advisory research work, for example, we are currently joining up to 100,000 people in a conversation, a virtual conversation about values. And many companies are now doing that. So the technology is extraordinarily developing extraordinarily quickly and gives us real opportunities, I think, to move on from the waves that we saw earlier. But of course, what's different this time in terms of the mass experiment is in the past, home workers always had the chance of getting out of the home, going into the office, going into a local hub. We now are home working, we have social distance, and we are isolating ourselves. And that, in my view, is a completely different issue, because we know that social isolation has real challenges in terms of mental health and also in terms of collaboration and purpose. So let's just take a look at the second poll now, please. And in the second poll, the question that I'd like to ask you is about your experiences right now. By the way, I'm keeping a diary.
You are?
Yes, obviously.
Well,
yeah, I'm keeping a diary because I think we're going to forget really quickly what it was like at the beginning. So I'm going to ask you right now to describe your experiences. This is day 3 for some of you. It's day 2 for me. And here's your choices. I love the autonomy and flexibility. I find the technology frustrating. Interestingly, few people are saying that. Gives me time to think and concentrate. As an academic, I've always enjoyed home working because that's where I write. I write from home. I don't write from a busy office. It works okay, but I miss the social interaction. That's coming out the strongest right now. And I keep getting distracted by my family. That reminds us all of that marvellous video, doesn't it? Of that economist giving the BBC and then suddenly his children appeared. Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of children appearing on the sides, particularly but isn't that interesting? So it works okay, but I miss the social interaction. I sort of would have predicted that because I think we've got the technology right. I think even 5 years ago, that would have been frustrating for lots of us. But actually, most of us have sort of got the technology right. Whereas beginning also to love the autonomy and the time flexibility. But it's really the social interaction that's an issue. And I think that's a really important problem and challenge that we have to face. So let's move straight into really what we might do about that. And I'm going to suggest we take 6 actions and we take them right now. So remember BT's experience, which is everything, performance, productivity, engagement goes down. And it goes down until you get it right. So the faster you can get it right, the more you reduce that productivity dip, which you're going to feel right now. So these are the 6 actions you should take right now. Number 1, technology. Invest in intuitive technology. You know, we know all about what that is. The fact that so many of you said it's not an issue for you means that that's an action you're already taken. But that's just a couple of points there. One is make sure it's part of the regular flow of work. People at home find it really difficult for you to use technology that they've never seen before. Make it sure it's the first port of call and match the technology to the task. And what I mean by that is if it's a simple project, then use project-based technology, but use video as much as you can. And I want to say a bit more about this later. And experiment with the big conversations. This is a great time for you to experiment with platforms that allow thousands of people to work together, to talk together, to have conversations about values, about how they're feeling and so on. So I would recommend that. The ones that we run for 3 days. So we have a platform open for 3 days. I would recommend we all use this opportunity as a time for experimentation. Number 2, social. Now, many of you have already said that you're feeling isolated and it's only day 3. Imagine how we're going to feel in 3 months' time. And yesterday, I'm a member of the World Economic Forum on work and the economy, and we had a conversation amongst ourselves yesterday about social isolation, and heard quite a lot from our Chinese colleagues, who of course are already into month 2. So I want to also say something about that, because I think that gives us some ideas. The first thing, and again, just do it now, reimagine the home workspace. When people went in to look at the homes of freelancers and people were working from home, they found that those that worked well tended to have a couple of things in common. One is they had they'd found a place to work where they were protected from outside distractions. And that also helped them to avoid feeling too rootless. So they had easy access to the tools of their trade. They used a space that was dedicated to work, which they left when work was complete. And they were also idiosyncratic in terms of what each person had. I would recommend, if you haven't done it already, that you ask everybody who you're leading about their working environment. And if that means helping them out with a budget to get the right chair, the right table, I would do it right now, because we're in this in the long haul. And as much as possible, you need to help people find a place to work at home. So we need to do that really by the end of this week. That's sort of how I'm seeing it with my own team. The second, and this is really, I think, the most important aspect of what we're going to talk about today in terms of social interaction, the area that you were most concerned about, is make it human. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, I would make a couple of suggestions. One is use high fidelity communications as much as possible. Humans really, really like face-to-face communication, and video allows us to do that. You can watch me now. I can't see you, but of course, on some of the platforms that you use, you could see 10 or 20 people simultaneously. I would recommend, as fast as possible, you start using video as a way of bringing people together. And I would also suggest that you build in right now what I would call water cooler conversations. So, for example, in my own team, who are around the world, we're going to, at 4:00, have a coffee break where we all sit in front of our video and drink coffee together, and don't actually talk about work. It's just going to be how are you finding things. And we're going to, on Friday, have a cocktail hour where we all sit and drink cocktails together. You need to put those in place as fast as possible, because human interaction isn't just about work conversations, it's about the water cooler conversations. And those happen face to face, and you need to build face to face opportunities for people to do that. So make it human. My third set of recommendations is about work itself. And here's some ideas. The first is that when you think about working in the office, there's a natural rhythm to that. You know, you come in, you chat around to people, you need to create some of those natural working rhythms when you're working virtually. So, for example, in my group, we meet actually at 9:00, not 10:00. We had a group meeting at 9:00 this morning, and we're going to meet again at 4, where everybody can sit and talk to each other. And I think those team meetings are going to be really crucial. You need to put them in the diary so people have some structure, because one of the concerns about work when it's from home is it becomes unstructured. So you need, as much as possible, to build natural structure into the way that people work. And also in terms of your projects, what we know from working from virtual projects is that they also need a structure. So if you're launching a project this week, as many of you will be, then remember that needs a kickoff structure, an onboarding structure, and a milestone structure. What we learned, by the way, from virtual projects is that people really need to know who each other is as early as possible, to learn something about what each other likes and what sort of person they are. That's where the coffee is going to come in useful. But also understand what the milestones are, which takes me to my final set of recommendations, which is about really building in task structures. And here's some ideas from that, which actually I've taken from Tata Consulting Services that's been working virtually, as IBM have been doing for many years now. This is what they do in terms of setting up projects and setting up work. Number one, absolute clarity about goals and key roles. Number two, definitions of people's boundaries and their control. Remember, when people are in the office, they work through boundaries and control on a moment by moment basis by going in to see somebody and saying, would you stop doing this, or could I take that from you? With that, because we don't have that, we need more clarity about boundaries and control, clarification of tasks and processes, and measuring roles and commitments. And one of the things, I think it's also very, very much about the culture that you set up. And remember, one of the issues about home working is that because people are out of sight, you don't trust them. And my recommendation here is to take the view that TCS takes, which is to say, trust someone until they have proven to be untrustworthy. So my final point here is to make sure that you trust people who are working from home. They're not skiving. They're not doing lots of other things. They're going to try as much as possible to make this work for you and to make it work for themselves. So in summary, these are the 6 actions I think we should be taking. They're around making sure the technology is intuitive and you learn to experiment. They're about social in terms of reimagining the home workplace and making it human. And finally, they're about work itself in terms of creating a natural work rhythm and focusing on collaboration and trust. And let me just finish by making a sort of a slightly philosophical point, which I think Julia and I are going to come to later. Let me just say a couple of things by way of finishing. Number one, I don't think that we'll ever get back to the place we were before this pandemic. I'm going to use the word pre-pandemic work and post-pandemic work. I think that because it's all of us, it's synchronous, it's not asynchronous, it's synchronous, and this will go on for months. I believe that it will fundamentally change the way all of us work. I was talking on the WEF conference yesterday to a Chinese businessman, and he said, I used to fly between Beijing and Shanghai every week and do 2 meetings. He said, now I use video conferencing and I do 5 meetings in a day. And I said, do you think you're ever going to fly that again? And he said, no, why would I? And, it seems to me, and those of you who read my books know, that I felt for some time it's time we change the way that we work. We've got into far too many bad habits in terms of too many meetings, having long commutes, and we've not spent enough time with our kids. And our carbon footprint and our mental health and the wear and tear have all warned us that this was wrong. But for all sorts of reasons, we haven't been able to stop it. This gives us an opportunity to shift that. It gives us an opportunity to reset the way that we work. And I think that, if we can keep this innovative spirit, and I, for one, over this period will be blogging and writing columns and doing webinars, I think that we can come out of this in a better place and more resilient than we went into it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Lynda. Terrific. So that was a wonderful kind of summary of both where we've been and what we're doing now, and indeed where we might go. I've been following all the questions, and I've been attempting to structure my thoughts on them. So we're going to have a little chat here. First of all, let me acknowledge some of the questions were about things which we're going to talk about in other webinars. So someone was asking about scenario planning. Well, we're absolutely going to talk about that next week. A couple of you are asking questions about how do we stop panic buying in shops? How do we make social distancing work effectively? Well, our colleague Neera Savanathan is going to be speaking about some of those behavioural things, I think, in 2 weeks' time. So I'm going to deliberately park the questions which are not directly related to this session. Mm-hmm. What I'm going to do is we're going to start with some of the very practical questions, and then we're going to kind of work out from the practical and the immediate to some of the more philosophical. We kind of end up in the big questions. So, where should we start? Someone said, building on your point about the water cooler.
Yeah.
What is the sort of the minimum physical engagement that we need. You mentioned that the BT workers were dropping off in productivity. We all get this notion that you can't completely isolate yourself. Can you give us any sort of guidelines about, once we get through the pandemic period and we can still have some sort of getting togethers, any thoughts on the rhythms of how often we should be made face-to-face versus how often we should be just working from home?
Well, I think, thanks for that question. It's a really sort of fascinating question. And there isn't really a hard and fast rule to that. It depends on the task and it depends on the person. So let's take the task first. I mean, for the moment, we're going to move into social isolation. Yeah. And so I think that's going to be the case. It's not yet the case in the UK, but I think it will be very rapidly. And so people aren't going to have any physical engagement. And as I said earlier, I think that's going to be problematic, and we need very quickly to bring in systems to bring that back. And video, of course, is absolutely the best way to do that. I think in terms of the post-pandemic world, there are some tasks where, you can do most of it completely on your own. Right. Writing a book, for example. When I write a book, I don't really talk to people. I just sit in my room and write it for years and years on end. Yeah. But there's other tasks where being face-to-face is really important. And one of the things we've learnt as psychologists is that knowledge is both explicit and tacit. Explicit knowledge you can sort of get by reading a manual or watching a YouTube. But tacit knowledge, as I mentioned earlier, is the sort of knowledge that you really need to be with people and listening to them and being coached by them. So I think the reason in that second and third wave that people moved from working from their home all the time to working in hubs is that they craved that physical connectivity. So I don't think anybody will want to work from home all the time. Right. I think what we'll be getting to is a sort of an ebb and a flow. And what might that look like? In terms of just time, I would say that we will definitely, at the end of this, have more flexible working. Right. Because I think we'll all have learned how to use the technology, right. We'll have learned how to use videos, and we might also have sort of enjoyed spending a bit of time at home. So what we might also do, which I've talked about a few times in my own work, is move to a 4-day week, which I personally have said for some time is a good thing. Primarily because those of you who know my work know my last book was called The 100-Year Life. We're going to work into our 70s. You can't do that. It's really hard to do that if you're simply working all the time. You don't have time to learn or regenerate. So I think in terms of regeneration, I would like to see this as an opportunity for some companies to experiment post-pandemic to move to a 4-day week.
So I want to build on that, a couple of questions that are linked to it. One was around, is decision-making more, shall we say, rational or less political online? And I think what they're getting at is, as a means for sharing information, online working is fine. We join a call. I was on one this morning, 10 people, we're sharing what we're doing, it's easy. But then sometimes we have to make decisions, right? And sometimes the decision in a face-to-face situation is, I'm looking at the body language, I'm trying to figure out how hard to push you. I mean, you just can't do those things in the same way in an online situation. So how are we going to manage the more difficult aspects of group dynamics around decision making? And someone made a question about this as well, how are we going to be able to kind of measure the success and effectiveness of our decision making processes?
I think again that's a great question, and thank you so much. And I know that we have an opportunity with some of the other professors down the line to talk more about that. We've encountered that actually very much in our own work looking at virtual working. For example, when we do virtual working, we do it right across the world. And what we've found is there's some cultures, and we work a great deal in Japan, where face-to-face contact is absolutely crucial for working out what the person is thinking. Exactly. So what we found our Japanese colleagues do is to use an emoji to show how they're feeling at any point in time.
Oh, that's cute.
So I think one of the things we have to learn as we move to virtual is actually to say how we're feeling. Right. So for example, this morning when I did my team, we asked each person, how are you feeling today? Yeah. And so I think that talking more about emotions is going to be so important because humans get so much of their signaling from body movement. And again, as I said earlier, I think videos are going to be really, really important because at least you can see people. But if you're in a very large group where you can't see them and you're just on a telephone link, I think we have to find ways like emojis that actually say, this is how I'm feeling right now.
That's right. So for your repressed British stereotypical manager, that's hard to do. We have to be a bit more expressive about what we're feeling because that feeling doesn't come out in an online setting, right? I mean,
no, certainly not with. So yeah, I think that might be one of the things that we learn is to express our emotions and maybe use technology as a way of just showing this is how I'm feeling right now.
I like that. That's terrific. And that links to a question which was around productivity or effectiveness gap between different age groups, between different national cultures. I mean, you touched on the Japanese story. I mean, it's a stereotype, isn't it, to say that, the millennials naturally use this technology. Is that actually true? I mean, is it the case that we're going to have to work harder to get people of, shall we say, our generation using this technology? Okay,
he knows this is going to get me really started. Technology and generations, there's no real evidence that there's massive differences between age groups in terms of technology. If you just look at dating apps,
right, indeed.
Apparently some of the major users of dating apps now are the over 50s, the over 60s and the over 70s. So please drop the stereotype about older people not wanting to use technology. There's no evidence of it, and it's stereotypical, and it makes older people feel bad about that. So just assume that all your employees are keen to use technology, and you just simply have to help them to do that. So I don't think you'll see any productivity difference in terms of age, and not necessarily in terms of culture in country. But as I said earlier, there are cultures like, as I gave the Japanese example, where face-to-face is very, very important. And so you have to bring in other ways of replicating some of those aspects. Remember with the BT example that whilst I said productivity dipped until they knew how to use it, in the end, productivity was higher than the group who were working from an office. And the reason it was higher is they actually had more productive hours in the day. So they were less likely to spend ages chatting to people around the water cooler.
Indeed. Okay, so a couple of questions. This is difficult, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Yep. Questions about advice for businesses supporting those who are at home with young kids, of course, a lot of kids are off school now, and some countries that's required, in other countries it's becoming the norm. Question about mental health. I mean, is this actually exacerbating the challenges that people who have mental health issues are facing? I mean, any thoughts or advice on those challenging questions?
Okay, firstly, the question of kids. I just sent a fabulous photograph to my family who have children this morning, which showed new home working, and it was a picture of a mum drinking a glass of wine with a cage next door to her with the children in the cage.
Maybe not advised.
So I'm not advising to put the kids in the cage. But I think what we would say is that we have to acknowledge that people who are working from home with children have a particular set of challenges facing them, both in terms of, just the physicality of where they're working. Because remember, in most of the world, both parents work. Right. So now you've got homes where two parents are working and they've got children who are no longer at school. So what can we do about this? I would say two things. Number one, talk about it. And I'm suggesting that you have daily conversations with everybody who's working from home, if not twice a day. And one of the questions you ask is, how are you getting on? Because this is a time of experimentation, and we'll have to learn how you work when there's two of you working and you've got kids around. The second thing I would suggest straight away is to think about scheduling. So to appreciate that everybody is not going to be able to work all the time. And rather than people hiding that, I think it's perfectly reasonable for you to say, if you've got kids at home, there will be periods when you're not going to be able to work, and acknowledge that and make it clear that that's part of the schedule of work. So I would say two things. Number one, be open about people's experience. We've been talking for years, as indeed have you, Julian, the Agile Corporation.
Exactly.
And the Agile Corporation learns and becomes agile. So we all have to move into a learning time when we actually are learning about these issues that we face, and then we can adapt. So I think being adaptive and thinking about scheduling is going to be really crucial.
Good. Neat question here about attention. So, for the last week, basically my diary has been emptied of all my previous bookings. I'm sure yours has as well. So in theory, I've got, huge amounts of time. In practice, I'm hugely distracted, right? I mean, I'm literally kind of watching the news by the hour to figure out how things are moving on. And so there's this fascinating question about how we filter out all the distractions this applies to working at home, but it also applies in daily life, so that we can actually focus on the right stuff in an effective way. Any practical tips on that? Because I think we're all feeling that.
Well, I think, two tips on that. One is to do with the individual, one is to do with their manager. I think from the individual's perspective, do you remember I mentioned that the freelancers learnt that they needed a place where they weren't being distracted? So we learnt decades ago, that people who were most productive at home had a space where they weren't distracted, where they went to, and when they finished, they moved from their working space, as it were, to their home space. And if there's a door or something in between, that's even better. So I think what we've all got to do as individuals, and certainly I have done, is to find a space that you can sit in. I actually am getting dressed and putting makeup on every morning. And that's not just because I'm on the video. So that we just actually, as much as possible, replicate. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would suggest, and it comes back to my earlier suggestion of having meetings every morning and every evening. What I did with my team today and yesterday is we went around and they all described what they were doing that day. So by doing that, you're also making verbal commitments to the rest of the team. You're saying today, so for example, I said, today I'm doing this webinar, and then I'm going to, and what I do as well is I actually kept a diary of the things I did yesterday, because I have a feeling that if after a week or two you're going to think, my God, what did I do?
Right, exactly.
But actually I can show you from my diary yesterday that I did 2 WEF sessions. I spoke to a journalist from the FT, obviously. I wrote this marvelous Sloan MIT article, you'll see. So I actually wrote that down so I could see. And then I also realized, by the way, that when I looked at my running thing, I hadn't done any exercise at all. I hadn't closed any of my circles. So today I have to moderate my behavior. So, I think it's what we know about learning is that people learn by getting feedback and by changing their behavior. So the more that you can ask people to verbally tell you what they're doing that day, not because you're checking up on them, but because they can also verbally commit to themselves, this is what I am going to do today.
That's a good point, because of course most people on the video will be familiar with agile working, which is the essence of agile working, of course, is a self-organizing team takes accountability and responsibility for its schedule. They have daily stand-up meetings, right? And those are physical stand-up meetings.
Yes.
And what you're saying is almost replicating that, but in a virtual world. And as soon as you do that daily commitment, it actually does force a greater pace of work. So I think that's
and
that's
I think
advice.
actually, Julian, your work on agile teams is really important here, because we've been pushing. We've all pushed towards agile teams. There's been quite a few barriers. The barriers are now down.
Yeah, that's right.
So use the same protocols you're using with agile teams now with your home workers.
But it does link very nicely to a question on your last point on focus on collaboration and trust. One of the biggest barriers to agile work is not the agile team, it's the boss of the agile team. In other words, that boss has to get their head around the fact that the agile team is making its own agenda and making its own priorities. And so I guess the point is, for those of us in positions of leadership, we've got to find ways of cutting some slack, if you like, to exactly as you say, giving more trust to those working remotely in agile virtual teams.
I think that's a really important point that you're making, Julian. I mean, You know, one of the reasons why home working never really took off is that bosses didn't work from home.
Right. That's right.
And so they had no sort of real understanding of what that was. And they often thought that people working from home were skiving.
Yeah.
Now all the bosses are working from home. And so I would say it's really important that you show empathy,
Yeah.
both to yourself and to the people that you're leading. Be empathic to their situation. Listen on a daily basis to the stories that they're telling you about their experiences, and change your protocols as fast as possible in order to reformat work, to reformat the home, so that people can actually use this period as an opportunity to become more resilient, have more resilient working practices. As I said at the beginning, I've been concerned about the way we work for some years now, and I've written extensively about that. And I don't think it's resilient enough for people now to work into their 70s. We have to change the way we work. This is our opportunity to do that. But to do that, you need, as leaders, to be empathic about the issues that people face, and to be trusting that they're doing the very best they can.
Got it. So let's move in the final piece. We'll probably go another 5 minutes or so to some of these bigger questions, and I've been recording quite a lot of them. You know, can we expect the death of the office job? I mean, that links to something you said earlier about an awful lot of people have been sitting in offices or going to business meetings, which they finally figured out they don't need to. But let me tie this to a much more kind of interesting linked question, which is, you know, we have this sort of belief that somehow big agglomerations, big 10 million, 20 million person cities is the way that the world is moving. You know, as soon as we've freed ourselves up, and I'm really talking about the developed world rather than the developing world here, Tokyo's and London's and New York's. But as soon as we've got ourselves away from this huge notion of agglomeration, you know, there are lots of high quality of life places we can work.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Isle of Skye, you know. I particularly like the Lake District. I know you're from the Lake District. I mean, why shouldn't a bunch of us actually, you know, start living in some of these places and, you know, coming to London only more occasionally?
Yeah, and I have a lot of sympathy with that view. As I said at the very beginning, I don't think that when this is over, we'll go back to the place we started. You know, it's the metaphor of the flowing river.
Exactly. Right,
you know, when you jump back in, it's not the same, and it won't be the same. And we have to acknowledge that. And if it goes on, I've been thinking about this from a psychological perspective. I mean, what we know is that habits form over a period of time.
Right. That's right.
And if it goes on for 3 months, and I have every belief that it will, then 3 months is enough time for new habits to form.
Right. That's a good point.
So what might those habits be?
Right.
Well, part of those habits will be that we use video more than we used to. You know, so everybody feels fine about having a video conference. Part of those means that we don't go into the office as much as we do. You know, all of us are worried about our carbon footprint. And we know that for many large companies, a major aspect of the carbon footprint is people commuting from their home into work. We know that has mental health issues. We know that many of you have a 2-hour commute. Right. How does it feel not to have that commute now, you know, in terms of your mental health? So I think that we will start asking ourselves, why do we work like that? I've been saying for ages, wouldn't it be marvellous if we didn't work in cities? And all move to cities. Right now, humans have moved to cities faster than is it imaginable. You know, humans are more likely to live in cities than they are in rural places. But wouldn't this be a great opportunity to actually move back to other parts of the country? In all, you know, we're speaking here in London, but I spend quite a bit of time in Tokyo. The Japanese government would love people to stop living in Tokyo and to live in the cities around Japan. So why not give this as an opportunity to think differently about where we locate ourselves?
No, that's right. And if you start thinking through the ramifications of that in terms of, you know, infrastructure, in terms of all those huge buildings which are going to be, you know, up for let, how much we rely on the trains and the planes, it does link very nicely to the whole sustainability agenda, which has been, of course, part of the conversation for many years. But it is fascinating, isn't it, that all the talk about changing our behaviors because of the risk of global warming have kind of come to nothing, whereas suddenly, this crisis dramatically changes how we behave. There's a fascinating psychological point about what it takes us to change. So it'll be kind of neat, won't it, in some ways, that this jolt to the system, which has been imposed in an unfortunate way, could actually help us to then change our behaviours in a positive way for the planet more generally.
It could. And I think that the reason I would feel positive about change is for two reasons. One is this is going to go on for months, so new habits can form. And secondly, it's everyone.
Right.
And what we know about new ways of working is the major blocker to new ways of working was also always leaders themselves.
That's right. Exactly.
And now that they're having to find new ways of working, they themselves are changing their behaviour. So I would recommend that, as I say, I'm keeping a diary, but do recommend that there are much bigger issues in play here. Yeah. Issues about where the post-pandemic world actually wants to be.
Wow. Good. Thank you, Lynda. That was a terrific point to end. Let me just give you 2 or 3 minutes worth of housekeeping before we close. First of all, the video will be available on Catch Up, and obviously the slides are part of that video. So if you want to remind yourself of anything that Lynda said, it will all be available, I'm guessing, tomorrow. The final slide, which if we could just move to it, that final slide tells you 2 things. First of all, right at the bottom, it has got the landing page for our entire webinar series. It's quite a long URL, but I'm sure you can write it down. That gives you access to the entire series. There are currently 7 that are up on that list, obviously including this one. We are about, probably next week, to announce a further 7. So there will be 2 per week for the entire period of end of March, April, and even into early May. And then I'd like to just make a particular plug for our next one, which is on Friday. Sir Andrew Lickerman is our speaker. I will be there to introduce him and to ask him questions. Sir Andrew is the former Dean of London Business School, and he's a Professor of Management Practice in Accounting. He's been doing a lot of research on judgment, making difficult judgments. And of course, those are very live issues to all of us all the time, particularly in times of crisis where there is so much uncertainty. So if you would like to register for that talk, many of you will have already done so, but if you'd like to register, go to the landing page that's mentioned there and you can apply to join that one at that point. So with that, I'm going to suggest that we finish. Thank you once again, Lynda, for a terrific set of ideas. Thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we'll see many of you virtually on Friday. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.